Hi, everyone. I'm Camilo Guerrero. I'm a public policy consultant at the Economist Intelligence Unit. First of all, I would like to thank BALCAP and Cobalt for your kind invitation to present in this event. So I'm going to speak about the Infrascope, which is a study measuring the enabling environment for PPPs. It is very exciting to hear there is so much interest in PPPs based on what previous speakers have said, and so I hope to contribute to this discussion with this presentation. So I will talk first about the background and objectives of our study, then I'm going to talk about the research framework, and then I'm going to go through some key findings and implications for policy. The ultimate objective of this presentation is to highlight what we have identified to be the key ingredients for a successful PPP framework and lessons on what policymakers can do to improve these frameworks. And this is based on our examination across more than 30 countries. So first, a brief background on why we have studied PPPs. The deficit of infrastructure has been much talked about, also in this event. There are estimates on infrastructure financing gap of around $1 trillion globally per year, and of above $200 billion in the EU. This is such an important challenge that the development of infrastructure has been recognized as one of the sustainable development goals by the UN. But at the same time, public budgets are limited. Private finance can help bridge the infrastructure gap, and indeed PPPs have been a great solution as they combine the regulatory role of the public sector with capital and expertise from the private sector. But these are usually complex projects and require adequate legal, technical, and financial conditions. So what exactly is the Infrascope? It is a study that evaluates the capacity of countries to implement efficient and sustainable PPPs. It aims to help countries navigate through this often complex topic. The focus on efficiency and sustainability stresses the fact that we advocate for projects that bring not only short-term economic benefits, but also overall sustainability to public finances, to communities, and the environment. We focus on the transport, water, energy, and solid waste management sectors, and we look at long-term contracts for the design, construction, operation, and maintenance of public infrastructure. The Infrascope assesses readiness and capacity by dividing the project life cycle in 5 components, which I will address shortly, and these are regulations, institutions, maturity, business environment, and financing. We have produced regional versions of the Infrascope since 2009. These have been commissioned by the multilateral banks. We have examined Latin America, Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Our latest edition was commissioned by the EBRD, and it analyzes 13 countries across Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and the Southern and Eastern Mediterranean. Additionally, we have examined 19 Latin American countries in a study commissioned by the Inter-American Development Bank. So this is an ongoing project with 8 new countries soon to be added. We have covered the Baltics back in 2012, but these haven't been assessed yet with the new methodology. So what is the aim of the Infrascope? We pursue 3 main objectives. The first one, as an information tool, we aim to describe best practices in the legal, institutional, and financial conditions for PPPs. We intend to offer a roadmap for countries to improve their PPP frameworks. Second, it is a benchmarking tool, so it allows comparisons within different dimensions of the country's PPP framework and also across countries. This way, countries can identify the most advanced countries in particular areas and learn from them. Third one is as a communication tool. We aim to offer key messages on this often complex topic that can promote dialogue and reform. So just briefly on the methodology, the framework of the Infrascope was developed together with the multilateral banks, the ADB, EBRD, and Inter-American Development Bank, as well as the World Bank, participated along with representatives of the private sector in the development of the research framework. So it was key to build upon the latest best practice knowledge and to develop a consensus with a community of experts to produce reliable analysis. Some key facts of the study. We studied 78 indicators, both qualitative and quantitative. For the qualitative assessments, we rely on a rigorous examination of laws and regulations. We interviewed experts and surveyed national authorities. Then we scored all the indicators, combined them, and produced aggregate scores so that we could measure category performance. Now let's have a look at the framework of the study. So this graph shows what we have considered to be the key ingredients for an optimal environment for PPPs. This combines regulations, institutions, maturity, investment and business climate, and financing. In the regulatory category, we examined the legal framework for PPPs, its guidelines, provisions for key stages of the project life cycle. We also looked at aspects such as risk allocation, fiscal control, and sustainability. We also looked at encompassing coordination mechanisms. In the institutions category, we examined specialized bodies for PPP coordination and promotion, as well as new forms of institutional support, such as project preparation facilities, project development funds, and we also examined transparency and accountability. In the third, the maturity category, we analyzed the experience in implementing past PPPs, but also certain conditions revealing the stability of the markets, such as expropriation risk and rules for contract termination. In the fourth category, we examined key factors of the country environment that can play a key role in the initiation and success of PPP projects, such as political effectiveness, business environment, political will, and competition environment. And lastly, in the financing category, we examine a range of financing options for PPPs and conditions for investors. We looked at government payment risk, development of local capital markets, participation of institutional investors, and new forms of financing such as green bonds, development impact bonds, and institutional investors. So we've published a series of infrascopes over the years, but in this last edition, we wanted to capture some of the key advances in best practices for PPP implementation. So we added some key new features. The first one has to do with sustainability. In alignment with the Sustainable Development Goals, we examined to what extent PPP preparation and implementation is considering social and environmental goals. We looked at requirements for consultations with communities and the social impact of projects. We looked deeper into environmental aspects, considering attention to disaster risk and climate change in project planning. Then we looked at new metrics on regulatory safeguards for fiscal control. One example is the rules for accounting on contingent liabilities to prevent excessive fiscal pressure. And also we looked at transparency measures and incentives to control instances of renegotiation. Third, we looked at transparency and accountability across the project life cycle in the regulations and institutions. We examined the existence of publication requirements for contracts, bidding documents, the existence of PPP registries, the systematic monitoring and evaluation of projects. And lastly, we examined new institutions of financing instruments, such as project preparation facilities, project development funds, and new instruments such as green bonds and development impact bonds. So these are some key results of the infrascope. This slide shows the top 10 performers out of the 32 countries we examined. In this edition, we emphasized category performance to identify areas of strength and weakness. So in blue, we have the EBRD countries. We see, and in white, we see the Latin America countries. So we see that generally Latin America countries are more advanced when it comes to the regulations, institutions, and financing. But some EBRD countries stand out for its maturity. That is the case of Turkey, and Serbia for its investment and business climate. This is, of course, a sample of 32 countries, 13 countries from Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and Southern and Eastern Mediterranean, and 19 countries from Latin America. The full results can be accessed in the website that I will introduce at the end of the presentation. But I would like to focus on the results of the Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and Southern and Eastern Mediterranean study, EECA-CEMET. And also, I would like to talk about trends we identified across these countries for the different categories, as this may offer lessons for any country wishing to improve its PPP frameworks. So first, on the regulations, with the regulations we looked at, these were a key part of the assessment, not only because they make PPPs viable, but also because they provide orientation to implementing authorities. Also, regulations are conditions that the governments can more easily influence. Perhaps one of the most positive findings is that we see that there are conducive regulatory frameworks across most countries, but we see that there is no single formula. So in some countries this has been addressed through the enacting of specific PPP legislation, but in other cases this is addressed through broader public procurement laws. And it's often supported by specific manuals. So again, this shows that there is no single recipe for having an efficient regulatory framework, as long as certain principles such as competition and transparency are present. As a sign of progress, we find that countries, a group of countries have passed new PPP legislation. That is the case of Belarus, Jordan, Kazakhstan, Morocco, and Romania. Looking at regulatory frameworks, we find a high level of convergence regarding the requirement for competitive bidding and also the use of cost-benefit analysis, value for money in project appraisal. And this reflects increased adoption of best practices across countries in the procurement stages. Then, regarding the institutions, we looked at institutions in place to prepare, award, and oversee PPPs. First, we found dedicated PPP agencies in most of the countries, which were either a central body or they were located in a specific sector with a role in promoting, coordinating, and overseeing PPPs. However, these agencies didn't always have adequate technical capacity or independence. We also examine institutions that are increasingly relevant to provide technical and financial assistance in the early project stages, but we found this only present in 4 countries, and indeed most countries rely on facilities provided by multilateral or regional bodies. Jordan and Kazakhstan were the more advanced countries in this area. The third category is maturity, and again here we looked at past project experience and also the capacity of countries to uphold laws and regulations. So we found across the countries that there was some degree of project experience. However, there was a great deal of diversity. So ranking at the top for this indicator, we found countries like Turkey, which had more than 60 national projects implemented in the past 5 years. On the other hand, we saw countries like Belarus and Kazakhstan that hadn't completed a project in the past 5 years. But these countries have updated their regulatory frameworks and are starting to build a pipeline of projects. One situation that we found interesting was that not always countries with the strongest experience show the most advanced regulations and institutions. And also we found countries with brand new regulatory frameworks that still need to be tested with actual projects. And this reveals that this is often a question of timing, as we see that some countries have developed projects and regulations based on specific sector needs. But this also tells us that initiating a successful PPP program requires more than adequate regulations, as important factors include political will, technical capacity, and favorable market conditions. The fourth category was investment and business climate. And here we found that there was political support in more than half of the countries. including from the government and the opposition. And it was very important to find that consensus was built across the political spectrum to guarantee continuity of these projects. However, we found instances of opposition from the broader public in more than half of the countries. And in some cases, we found this to be because of misperceptions around the PPP model. Therefore, we advocate in our study for developing communications and stakeholder engagement strategies when expanding PPP programs. The fifth category is financing, and here, again, we looked at the range of financing facilities available for PPPs. First, it was the category that showed the lowest performance. A positive outcome was that countries show a good track record in honoring their obligations with very few instances of default, which should facilitate access to finance in the future. A key finding is that most countries are ranked as either nascent or emerging when it comes to the development of their domestic capital markets, and as local capital markets are still emerging, they rely on international financial institutions to fund PPPs. And lastly, we found that green bonds, development impact bonds, are absent in most countries, and there is limited participation of institutional investors. One exception was Turkey, where we found usage of green bonds, development impact bonds, and participation of institutional investors, particularly in the healthcare sector. So this was the fifth and final category of the index. On the next slide, I summarize some of the main areas for improvement that we identified across the 13 countries. But also, we found this to be relevant in the group of Latin American countries. So that tells us that this may offer important lessons for any country wishing to improve its framework. So first, we found that mechanisms for coordination were generally lacking. It is worth noting that the highest ranked countries often had the highest performance in coordination, so that tells us how important overall coordination is. We analyzed coordination through different perspectives. So for example, we analyzed whether national infrastructure plans were aligned with PPP programs, and we found this coherence only in 4 countries. We emphasized the need for a consensus and a long-term view for PPP programs, which can be helped with a comprehensive national infrastructure plan. We also examined coordination through looking at the existence of mechanisms for coordination among public agencies, such as specific guidelines or interministerial bodies, but these were lacking in about half of the countries. Then, despite recent developments on the regulatory front, we find that most countries still need to refine and harmonize regulatory frameworks. In particular, we didn't find a clear recognition of the importance of rules on contingent liabilities or renegotiations. Third, regarding transparency, we found that while bidding documents are usually published in most countries, after project award, transparency becomes more problematic. Full contracts, contract changes, for example, are published in no more than 3 countries, and in very few countries we found a systematic process of project performance reporting or auditing or evaluation processes. And lastly, concerning sustainability, we found that criteria assessing sustainability of the projects are missing in most countries, aside from requirements for environmental impact assessments. Considerations for climate change, disaster risk were largely missing. Regarding social aspects, we found that communication of consultation processes is often limited. This is an area where Latin American countries showed a clear advantage over the group of countries in Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and the Mediterranean. So on the next slide, I have the 2 top performers in our study from the Eastern Europe and from Latin America. And I wanted to present what these countries have in common, even though they're quite different countries. The first thing to note is that none of these country leaders have perfect scores yet, so there are still areas for improvement in both of them. But if we look at the regulations, we find that both countries have clear and comprehensive PPP frameworks that allow clear interpretation by implementing authorities. Although it's somewhat different, Chile has an encompassing PPP legislation, whereas Slovakia relies on public procurement laws with specific manuals. Looking at the institutions, we find that both countries have dedicated institutions with adequate technical capacity. In Slovakia, this is located specifically in the transport sector. Regarding maturity, we find project experience in both countries and also a stable environment to support new projects. Both countries have successfully developed PPP programs recently. Fourth, on the investment and business climate, we find a favorable business environment with openness and political support. And lastly, regarding financing, we find across both countries low risk for investors and more in Chile than in Slovakia, developed capital markets. So lastly, what are the implications of our analysis for policy makers? First implication is that although there have been improvements in the regulatory frameworks, there is still room for improvement. Countries can take advantage of available best practice knowledge to refine these. We emphasize the need to improve coordination by clearly defining the institutional roles, which can help avoid inefficiencies in the process. Regulations should also provide clear orientation and facilitate execution of the projects. Second, we support a holistic approach to sustainability. So sustainability should consider communities, making sure that there is buy-in from communities through consultation and communication processes. Also, it should consider the environment with consideration for climate change and disaster risk. And third, it should consider the long-term effects on public finances, avoiding excessive fiscal pressure with appropriate safeguards. Third, transparency should be embedded in regulatory and institutional frameworks across all project phases. So this includes selection, procurement, management, and evaluation. And it's important to stress that these mechanisms are not only useful for control purposes, but also to promote dissemination of knowledge and learning in the public sector. And lastly, the development of adequate technical capacity in PPP units and sector ministries will be crucial for expanding PPP programs. These agencies need to build skills on areas such as project financing, risk evaluation, and contract design. We have seen that PPP units can be a force in driving quality improvements in the PPP programs, but they should be helped by giving them clear responsibilities and independence. So to finalize, I would like to invite you to visit the website of the Infrascope, which houses all the information we have gathered through this study. This is a resource for the public to explore and use the Infrascope. You can find the tables with all the results of the study. You can download the findings and methodology report with additional analysis and our definitions of best practices. And you can download the full model tool, which includes all the data driving the indicator and category scores. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have now.
Thank you, Camilo. Any questions from the audience? Then maybe I have one question. How do the results of Infrascope compare to the previous ones? Has any progress been evidenced?
Well, yeah. Unfortunately, the methodologies of the study have changed since we last did it in this year. But we were able to identify trends. In particular, we find, as I mentioned earlier, there were important improvements in the regulatory frameworks. We find, in particular, that there were clear requirements and requirements that were being enforced in terms of competitive bidding and also the use of economic criteria for selection processes. So that has been a positive improvement. Looking at Eastern Europe, for example, we find that in terms of maturity, there hasn't been much of a change in terms of project implementation. We see the countries that were experienced back then are still the most experienced countries now, and we still see certain countries that are still kind of hesitant and they still haven't managed to get to implement a full project.